The purpose of our study was to tackle a recurring question on why citizen led protests sometimes succeed in influencing the decisions of government and why they sometimes failed. This question is part of the big question being asked by this body of work at the Institute for Development Studies. And the big question is the question about accountability and empowerment of citizens in fragile and conflict affected settings. For our study, we focused on protests by citizens around fuel subsidy or energy subsidy in Nigeria. We noticed that occasionally, when adjustments are made to the prices of fuel, there are widespread protests all over the country, sometimes leading to a downward review of that upward adjustment. And other times, even when the adjustments led to high price increase, occasionally there are no protests, or these protests do not lead to any change in government decisions. Um, and this becomes an important question for us because a lot has been said about the power of the citizen and how much influence citizen organizing can affect in a democracy like ours. And yeah, while literature has not been conclusive about that, it opens up a number of questions as well. And so we set out to conduct a comprehensive study of energy protests in Nigeria. There is possibly no better place to do such to conduct such a study than Nigeria, where we've had serious episodes of energy protests leading to sometimes government rescinding its decision and other times not. And so we conducted in Lagos a number of focus group discussions among citizens in low income and middle income sections of Lagos. We also conducted in depth interviews with government agencies, especially agencies that had to do with the downstream sector in the petroleum sector, in the energy sector. Specifically, we focus on PMS, Premium Motor Spirit, popularly called petrol, because this is one commodity whose price increase usually leads to uproar in Nigeria, because, as we learn, it affects virtually every aspect of life in the country. So our study involved focus group discussions among citizens um, in the different locations in Lagos. Our analysis of this suggests that that protests sometimes are effective when a broad coalition of citizens are involved in this. But more than that, we discover that protests that are effective often has the input, subtle and sometimes direct, of very powerful people in society. These are often politicians in the opposition. And as a result, their involvement, sometimes their sponsorship of this process, sometimes cast doubt on the credibility and the authenticity of the protest. Even when government decisions are rescinded, um, accusing fingers are pointed at opposition as the ones behind the protest rather than the protest being genuine citizens' outbursts. We also discovered that the ability of the protest to lead to accountability and empowerment uh, in Nigeria is severely limited by weak institutions. Even where it becomes very clear that, for instance, deregulation is the solution to the shortage of, or to the opacity in the downstream sector. The institutions are so weak and such that outright absolute deregulation becomes impracticable. There are also the problem of elite capture that I mentioned earlier, and there is the problem of widespread corruption. One on that, which are factors that make protests really, really ineffective most times. One other important factor that we discovered was protest fatigue on the part of citizens. After a number of protests, it became quite difficult, if not impossible, for civil society to organize citizens for another round of protests. We found this as the case is in the increase in the fuel prices and the attempt to mobilize citizens to protest in 2014 and in 2015. Um, Therefore, we think that frameworks that open up the civic space for dialogues, ongoing dialogues between citizens and government, may produce better outcomes in the final analysis than protests. Ironically, those frameworks may actually themselves not emerge unless citizens mount sufficient pressure.